Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat teaching by Rabbi-Cantor Chorny.
If you do want to follow along with the very first source in particular in the Chumash, I'll tell you where we are. We're on page 475 in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. It's the middle of chapter 23, verse 27. We'll get there in a moment. Before the text, the context where I'm starting to teach from in Parshat Mishpatim, we're getting some previews of the years to come from God. Notably, the clergy of Temple Beth are currently studying from the Mishnah Masachet Bikurim about first fruits, and some of the texts that are core to our studies are here on page 474, part of the fifth aliyah for next week's Torah reading, in the full Shabbat morning Torah reading. And some of the stuff that we're learning about categorically in Parshat Mishpatim are just the laws to come. For example, these first fruits, the Bikurim. Right? When you possess the land, when you've inherited it, you will go and give of your first fruits, and you will offer them in honor of God, in gratitude to God for providing them in the land and all that. And there's a little bit of preview storytelling as well. We know from the beginning of Bereshit that God likes to tell God's people where the story is headed, where things are going. And I think there's a particular tone to some of the language used in Parshat Mishpatim around this preview storytelling, what is to come in the spaces, places, and among the peoples whom they're going to meet along the way. At the bottom, let me preempt and read a little bit from the 23rd verse. Ki yelech malachi lefanecha, when my angelic representative force goes out before you, and before you on this march, on this journey all through the wilderness. V'heviacha el ha'emori ha'chiti v'ha'prizi v'ha'knani ha'chivi v'yavusi v'hichadtiv. You're going to be brought, the angel's going to lead you, basically, is going to come before you and is going to approach all of these different people you're going to encounter along the way, and I annihilate them. Lo tishtachave leloehem v'lo ta'avdam v'lo ta'aseh k'ma'asehem. Don't bow down to their gods. Don't worship like they worship their gods, and do not do as they do. Ki hares tehorsem, this like duplicative word. Well, I'll finish translating the sentence. Ki hares tehorsem v'shaber teshaber matzavotehem. Two doubling of languages. You're going to really tear them down and really smash them to bits. So not only don't follow their laws, but also smash them to bits. Okay. Ve'avadtem et Adonai Elohechem uverach et lachmecha ve'et memecha ve'hasiroti machala mi kirbecha. And you should, rather, after you're done smashing all these idols, in the meantime, you should be serving the Lord your God. God is the one who blesses your bread and also your water, right? God satiates and quenches thirst. And left off in the middle of the verse, and also God will remove like plagues or any sort of sickness from your midst. Lo tiyeh mishakela va'akara be'artzecha, a beautiful promise that no woman should miscarry. There will be no barren woman in your land. Et mispar yamecha amale, I will literally fill the counting of your days. A beautiful idea also, just the fulfilling that numerousness of the people, and a nice bookend to the beginning of the story, when, of course, who is most in danger at the beginning of the Exodus story? Who do the midwives come to save? What decree do we learn about at the very start of the story? That the Jewish boys, that it's decreed that Jewish boys should not be allowed to live, right? And so this is a promise from God that not only will they be allowed to live, but all of the bearing of children will be allowed to go forth with blessing. Now the verse from the teaching that I'd like to lead us down the road of. Et emati ashalach lefanecha, v'hamoti et kol ha'am asher tavo bahem, V'natati et kol oyevecha elecha oref. I will send out my terror before you. This is in that vein of sending out things before you, sending out the angel. Now God is sending out terror before us. V'hamoti et kol ha'am asher tavo bahem. And I will also give as hamoti, I will give my a sense of panic. It's a synonym. I'll say more about that in a moment. Before any of the peoples who come among whom you come, right? You approach these people. I will send fear among them, and I will place among your enemies at kol oyevecha elecha oref. What is oref? Oref. You're pointing to it. It's the back of the neck, right? The backside of one's neck. Okay. Before we determine what oref means, before we determine what oref means in this particular context, before we determine what oref means in this context, I want to point out that this verse is actually a threefold poem, a miniature poem, and a set of parallels. Okay, this is my interpretation, no one else's. What's the first part? Et emati ashalach lefanecha. I will send out my fear before you. What's the next part? What's the next piece of parallel? What means almost exactly the same thing as that? I will send forth my terror before you. In the English, what's the next part of the parallel? I will, right? Just in exact parallel, we call this tikbolet in biblical and even early rabbinic literature, the notion of a parallel thing that really just means the same thing as the thing before it, which means we might learn that the third part itself is also a parallelism. V'natati et kol oivecha, and I shall put into or place among all of your enemies this oref, this neck. So what does that seem to be? Are we talking about an actual neck? What could it, if we were being literal, what might it mean in regards to a neck? Yeah.
I think it would mean that they turn to run.
Okay, great. I think it's dancing in the world of symbolism, and it's the world that Ibn Ezra is going to dance in. But I agree. I think it means something about turning their back, and therefore you would see the neck. Any other way this could mean something literally? V'natati et kol oivecha elecha oref, and I will somehow give place your enemies before you, oref. There's one other hidden meaning that we're going to get to that is delightfully spicy, and we'll get there in a minute, getting to the literal meaning of the word. So Ibn Ezra goes in the direction that you were going in for just a moment, having to do with the back of the neck, and says, what does this mean? Hu pachad b'neshama. This is a soulful type of fear, soul fear. Is there a way we can say that in English? Like soul, like it chills you to your soul. Do we say that? Not really.
Shook me to my core.
Shook me to my core, right? Something like that. Like it's core-shakingly scary. Vehine tavo laguf cholasha meyad. And then immediately, this is giving us a hint at the teaching we're going to look at in Sota. And in fact, pausing just for a second in this, I did break my rule. I typically stick with just chronological order. So really, Ibn Ezra may know the text that we're about to read after this, and may have learned from it, but believes that it's not just a pachad b'neshama, a fear that's in the soul. Also, the body immediately follows and becomes kind of weak, right? The body goes, is there a way we say that about what happens when we're in fear in English? Do we have a saying like that? Like the body, I went weak in the knees. That's the one I was trying to think. Yeah. Shiver me timbers. That's even better. I love that one. Right. So something about the soul fear and the body fear immediately follows. V'zenatati et kol oivecha elecha oref. This is what's meant by this phrase, that I'm going to place some sort of this oref into your enemies. Shitnu lecha et orfam. I'm going to give you, meaning I'm going to give you, I'm going to turn them away from you so that you can see the back of their necks. V'hatam shivrechu mipanecha berotecha otam. And that is, they're going to, as soon as you look at them, they will flee. You give them one look, and what's going to happen? First, they're gonna be filled with anxiety and fear and panic. That's what verse means. Second, their bodies are going to go weak, or shiver me timbers. They're going to go weak in the knees. Okay, great. Now for a Gemara that I think is remarkably parallel to the way that we describe bodily fear or embodied fear nowadays. It's in the middle of a telling of a story. Some of you are smiling because you already read ahead a little bit, I assume. And this is the middle of a story about what happened. The Gemara imagining, as it often does, that a multiplicity of miracles took place in the course of a singular day. And it often uses this language, bo or a kamanisim, right? Go and look at how many miracles nasu ba'oto hayom were done for the Jewish people, were done for them on that day. Avru Yisrael ta Yarden. Israel went across the Jordan River. Okay. Uva ulahar grizim. They got to this mountain, har grizim. Ulahar eval yoter mishishim mil. They got so far. Okay. It's more than 60 mil away. This interpretive piece that's interpolated from Steinsaltz says from the river. The point is they went really far. The ein kol bria yechola la'amod bifneihem. Kol bria. What is kol bria? What's bria? Creature. Excellent. I like that translation. Right? In this case, it's not related to briut, but rather something that is, it's using the word bara, created, right? And so it's any sort of a creature, exactly. Not a single creature could even stand before them. V'chol ha'omed bifnehem miyad nitraz. And anyone who stood before them immediately, what is nitraz? Diarrhea. Yeah, they pooped their pants in fear, right? This is the exact meaning of the teaching. They were so scared. What happened? Yeah, that's exactly right. All right, I'll censor it for the podcast. I won't translate it. They did something, right? And it was their entire body releasing. Now, before I finish teaching this text, would you say that this is an experience that feels distant, like it's happening to a people, and would never in a million years happen to human beings nowadays? Or would you say that this is very relatable? On what scale? Like how close is this idea? Would you say like you understand what they mean, or I have no idea what they're talking about? You understand? Okay, great. I also understand. I understand what they mean. Right? Weak in the knees, shiver me timbers. Your whole body goes weak, and you can't even hold in your bodily function. Shena emar et ematia shalach lefanecha v'hamoti et kol ha'am asher tavo bahem, etc. Okay, here's my question though. How did they get that from Oref? Anyone have an idea? I had to do quite the deep dive. In what way? No, it was not a hint, but gross. Yeah, thank you. No, I had to do a dive into this word oref and ardaf, a place where we see that word according to both Jastro and BDB. The place where we see that word turned into a verb is taraf, as in the drippings of dew. So they get this idea that literally the body will drip with fear. Okay, literally the body will drip with fear. Yes, Joy. Right, and what does that mean? What's Kishinu Oref? How do we translate that in our Machzor? I don't remember. Anyone else remember? Yeah, it's like, I think stiff-necked is how we translate. And there, you're welcome to pull a Machzor off the shelf and see how we translate it. Because what are we in a baby Josh for if not? Kishinu Oref, I think we do say a stiff-necked, we were stiff-necked. In that case, are we talking about anxiety or fear? Probably more like stubbornness, right? So, but the neck seems to be a source of major emotional connection. Okay, I want to take us to a completely different part of our story. Turn to the next page. Take a look at Breshit. We're looking at the very end of the story. The context is blessing. Who's blessed at the end of the book of Breshit? Who receives blessings? I'll give you a hint. There are like 12 of them. Yeah, the sons, exactly, right? And so we're going to look at the blessing that is received by Yehuda. Yehuda ata yoducha achacha, yadcha be'oref oivecha, ishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha. Let's have a vote. Poetry or not poetry? Raise your hand if you think it's poetry. I think it's poetry. Anyone think it's not poetry? Anyone else they need to dive deeper into the text? Okay, let me see if I can treat this like a poem. Just like we treated the last verse like a poem. Yehuda Your brothers will yoducha. What is yoducha? Related to the word hodu, not turkey. Thank, right? Well, thank. Your brothers will give you praise. Yadcha, your hand, be'oref oyevecha. Your hand is going to be on the oref. What did we say? The neck of your oyevecha, your enemy, your enemies. So your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be, what's that image, the hand on the neck of your enemy?
If you have a sword and you were going to strike someone, that would be where you would strike them with the sword.
Right. So you have access to the most vulnerable part of them. If you had a sword, you could strike them down in one swift order. And finally, Yishachavu lecha b'nei avicha, your father's sons, poetically saying your brothers will bow down to you. Where did we see that image before of your brothers bowing down to you? In Yosef, in the dreams, right? The brothers not bowing down, but now it's turned and it's Judah. And Judah is the one who his brothers will bow to. Why are his brothers bowing to him according to this verse, according to the plain meaning of this verse? Why will Yehuda's brothers bow to him? Just according to the plain meaning of the verse. Yishtachavu lecha b'nei avicha. Why? Judah has the power to defeat the foes. Judah with the hand on the neck of the enemy. That's right. I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you not to answer it until we read through the Chorny. Who is putting the fear of whom in whom? Right? Who's fearful of whom in this particular scenario? Think about that for a moment. We're going to go to a commentary from 13th century France, from the Chorny, who adds this. This is Yehuda atayoducha achicha lashon nofel al halashon klomar yishabechucha v'yichabducha v'kaasher yiru sheyadcha be'oref oivecha az yishtachvu lecha kamo lamelech. We're going to skip the brackets for time purposes. So your brothers are going to come and they're going to praise you or acknowledge you as a leader. And this is a bit of a play on words because Yehuda is synonymous with with being the great and the head. Who is Yehuda? Yehuda is the lion, and Yehuda is a stand-in for all of the Jewish people. Okay. Because this will happen when they see you, Judah, subduing your enemies by holding on to their necks. So who is afraid of whom? In the Chizkuni's read of this verse, who is afraid of whom?
Brothers are afraid of Judah.
The brothers are afraid of Judah. In turn, there's a secondary, I think, correct answer to this, which is who is also afraid of whom? Who are our enemies afraid of now? They're also afraid of Judah, right? Because he's got them by the nape of their neck. So Judah is putting the fear in the foes, and therefore his brothers look to him and they fear him. They have this praise-fear relationship with Judah. They perhaps look up to him, but also it's quite fearful. Now, we're going to make a sharp left turn from this idea. After I ask one question, we're going to go into a set of texts that seemingly are disconnected, and I promise to do my best to connect them. Why are his brothers afraid of him? Why are Judah's brothers afraid of him? What is the source of their fear?
He's the oldest.
Okay, so he's got that older brother energy and is scary. According to the verse, what seems to be fear-inducing about him? His strength, his physical strength. Why do we tend to fear people in general? What are we usually afraid of in life? Externally, I mean. That they will lash out? Oh, that they will act out. Okay. All right, who will act out? The foes or the brothers?
In this context, I'm talking about Judah. In other words, the brothers would be worried about that he'll do something to them, perhaps because of his past behavior, perhaps because of very recent events, or perhaps since there's no timeline here, something that will happen in the near future, how fast? Kind of complicated.
I didn't even think of it. Thank you.
That's too complicated. I'm not sure it's right.
No, I love your take on this, and I think it goes down a path that I'd like us to contemplate as we go into this next set of verses. So what I hear as your take is they might be afraid of his brother because his brother is demonstrating tremendous strength. A scary amount of strength, so scary that the foes are afraid of him. And now they might in turn find that Judah is very scary to them, because we know that when people are fear-inducing, when people are strong, when people demonstrate to us that they're willing to use their hands to do physical violence, that can in turn lead us to believe that we, under the wrong circumstances, could find ourselves in the position that we see somebody receiving their physical brute, mighty strength at that time. Did I get that about right?
That's the first half. The second half has to do with, I think, Haftorah, recent Haftorah. So
great. We'll go down the road of a recent Haftorah later. I like your first take because I think it gives us something excellent to think about as we move into these final verses, which have to do with tefillin. And fortuitously and coincidentally, Rabbi Kligfeld offered a teaching earlier this week that I'm going to circle to in just a moment to Bat Mitzvah Sally Kurtzer, who came to put on tefillin for the first time this week at our daily minyan. That goes to the meaning and the definition of what tefillin are. So I'll get there in just a moment. First, a verse. We read from Shemot, we read from Bereshit, now something from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. V'ra'u kol amei ha'aretz ki shem Adonai nikra alecha v'yare'u mimeka. All the peoples of the earth, of the land, shall see that the name of God is called out and proclaimed over you, and therefore, I'm adding the therefore, they will see you and they will fear you. They will be in awe of you, because who's on our side? God's on our side, and therefore they're going to fear us. Okay, so a teaching about tefillin. Both that verse and this teaching from Talmud Menachot and another one that's buried in the next story are all leading up to the story in English, which we'll get to in a minute. So I'm preemptively telling you, I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read this story at the bottom of the third page in English, but not yet. So think about whether you're willing to read. I'd love to hear another voice than mine. Menachot 35b. V'ra'u kol amei ha'aretz, this verse that we were looking at. Ki Shem Adonai nikra alecha v'yar'u mimeka. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, Omer. Elu tefillin sheberosh. Okay. And all the nations of the land will see that God's name is upon you. This verse we just looked at. It was taught in a Braita that Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, the great, said, what is this in reference to? Tefillin sheberosh. What's that? The head tefillin. Now, in order to understand this story and the next, you need to also know that there was a long time among our people when tefillin was not just worn during the daily service. When would people wear tefillin? When would men mostly wear tefillin? All day long, right? With the exception of when they needed to take it off to be in a an immodest or a dirty place. Other than that, they would be wearing their tefillin all day long. So this is the notion. Read it back in for a second. If this is tefillin, what are the people of the land seeing that is making them afraid?
The Batim, presumably?
They're seeing the housings, the actual tefillin on somebody's head, and it's making them afraid. What's on the tefillin? They're black boxes typically. And what do we see on the outside of a tefillin? A shin. And what does the shin reference to? To the name of God, or to the countenance and being of God. So this idea is they'll see God's name written on the outside of these things, these amulets that you're wearing. And how are they going to feel? They're going to go, yikes, right? So shiver me timbers, exactly. Back to shiver me timbers. They're going to go, yikes. Okay. Vasiroti et kapai veraiti et achorai amar Rav China bar Bizna. And then in turn, Amar Rabbi Shimon Chasida, Milamed Shahara'a lo Hakadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe kesher tefillin. So in citing a verse that I will remove my hand and you will see my back, who's speaking in that verse? God is speaking to Moshe in that verse. And Rav Chana Bar Bizna teaches in the name of Rabbi Shimon Chasida that who showed Moshe their tefillin? God. God showed, and what part of the tefillin? The kesher. What is the kesher?
The knot.
The knot of the tefillin. Now, marry the first part of this story to the second, the first part of this Gemara, the Reisha to the Seifa. People are going to fear us because they see God's name is written on the amulets that we wear going through the world. They know God's on our side. Now, read that into the second part of this. What was God doing by showing Moshe the kesher tefillin? Potentially scaring him. Is that a relationship that we see between God and Moshe? Awe and fear?
Yeah.
Maybe, sometimes. And by the way, what part of God is Moshe purportedly allowed to see according to our text? Only that back of the head. All these texts have in common this notion that one of the most vulnerable and also fear-receiving and fear-inducing parts of our body is the neck, which is interesting, my own take on this also, that then I think the notion of keeping a knot of amulets on the back of your neck, one that would induce fear, is potentially exactly why one will wear an amulet, for a sense of protection. This notion of having a knot at the back of one's neck, which is of course such a vulnerable part of the body. But when God shows off that kesher tefillin, that knot at the back of God's neck to Moshe, presumably, according to this Gemara, according to this particular Gemara, this is a moment of inducing fear in Moshe. Okay. Did you think about whether or not you'd be willing to read the next bit out loud? It's all in English. This is a story that was told to me and a story that was told to that person, a story told to another person. I wrote it down as best as possible.
There is a famous story that occurred within the Vilna Gaon. This happened when he was traveling incognito during a self-imposed exile. He was staying at the home of a wealthy man. One morning, they were davening shacharit in the man's home. The Gaon was praying in an inner room when all of a sudden he heard a ruckus in the outer chamber. He ran outside and found hoodlums roughing up the people in the minyan. When the ruffians glanced at the Gaon, they were seized with terror and they ran for their lives. The Gaon's host looked at him with wonderment and asked him quizzically, "Why'd they run away from you? Is there something that I don't know about you?" The Gaon said simply, "They fled from my tefillin." The host retorted, "But I'm also wearing tefillin." It was then that the Gaon pointed out a simple inference from the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer says that tefillin generates fear when they're in the head, not when they're simply worn on the head. The Gaon explained that he integrates in his mind the lessons of the tefillin.
There's a pause there in the story for just a moment. Thank you for reading. Okay. In this story, what's the scary situation? Hoodlums in the shul, the name of my next murder mystery after my next sabbatical. I'm too close for comfort, right? Because, of course, this notion that people would come in, ruffians, I like that translation, from a Yiddish source, by the way. Ruffians came in, people who weren't supposed to be there were there, and they were causing bodily harm to the people who were in the minyan. That is a scary situation. And what stops the scary situation from happening? What disrupts that scary situation? Or who? The tefillin of the Gaon of Vilna. And why were the tefillin of the Gaon of Vilna so different from the tefillin that the guy who owned the place, who presumably was the Baal, the host and the master of this Shachrit minyan? What was different about the way that the Vilna Gaon wore his tefillin?
It says here, he integrates in his mind the lessons of the tefillin, which to me means he was thinking about what was in the tefillin.
He was thinking about what was in the tefillin. Because, of course, in all of these texts, we can doubly read the phrase tefillin shebarosh or barosh, it could mean, what do we think of? It's the tefillin that are on the head. But the Vilna Gaon says, no, these are about the tefillin that are in the head. This is about the text and living the tefillin being inside of you. Now, coincidentally, as I was looking at this text, on Thursday morning, Rabbi Klickfeld taught beautifully about this notion to Sally, the bat mitzvah. And you'll tell me if I don't get this quite right, but looking at the translation of tefillin themselves, what tefillin seem to mean, that's feeling that the totafot, this notion of the amulet, seem to mean, according to dictionary definitions and digging in on this idea of totafot, the totafot, of course, being one of the phrases that we use to describe these amulets in our core Shema texts, which in turn are inside, right? It's all meta, it's inside the tefillin. What those seem to be are penetrative. They seem to be piercing. They seem to be meant to be something that goes in. Am I missing any part of that definition? Oh, penetrative? Okay, great. On that notion of penetrative, the Vilna Gaon goes on in this story to tell a very frightening but powerful story about the way in which tefillin were conceived of, not just by him, or rather, maybe it is just by him, maybe it is his own conception, but it is the notion that tefillin are not just about putting them on a head, but rather putting them in your head. So, Joey, will you read the rest of the source?
Yes. In Masechet Eruvin, we learn the story of Elisha Bal Knafayim. It relates that the Romans made a decree that anyone who wears tefillin, Yitakru et mocho, his brains will be pierced. This is a highly unusual decree, since normally kings say off with his head and not pierce his brains. However, when the Romans understood that the main idea of the tefillin is not to simply don them upon the head, but to put the message inside one's brain, therefore the punishment was to fit the crime, and one's brain should be pierced.
Whoa. So according to the Vilna Gaon, according to Masechet Eruvin, in this amazing story that we didn't have time, I didn't bring it as a source, right? I think I ended it there. Yeah. I knew we would run out of time, and I'm going to wrap here. He understood that even the Romans understood that tefillin were not simply this thing that you had to put on as a garment. We already have several other things we simply put on our body as garments. We've got the covering of our head, which teaches us about a sense of dignified modesty before the Holy One. We've got what other garments? Right, a talit katan, if you want to be a little bit more parallel to this idea of wearing tefillin all day, the notion that we might wear fringes to remind us of what? The mitzvot, the commandments. They're supposed to be fringes we learn in those same paragraphs that are kept within the tefillin, right? This idea of these paragraphs related to these totafot, which are meant to be penetrative things, not just amulets worn on the outside to show other people, but rather something that penetrates within. And this goes to the heart of the teaching about Vilna Gaon and why it was that those hooligans were so afraid of him and not afraid of the innkeeper. Because this story is meant to teach that the thing that is possible, but we don't always think about as being possible, is the notion of being feared for being a good person. The notion that your love, this ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, being in a loving relationship with God, would be so powerfully inside of you that the way that you would live your life induces fear, not because, like a Judah, your hand is on the neck of your enemy, and therefore even your own brothers find themselves shaking in their boots because they know that what you can do to someone else, you can also do to your own brothers. We know they did in the story. But rather that the way in which you live your life, the way in which these totafot are penetrative to you, the way that the Vilna Gaon wore his tefillin may have looked on the outside exactly the same as the innkeeper, but he was such a good person. I like to read back into this story that this is a tongue-in-cheek way that the Vilna Gaon was, in some sort of miraculous and perhaps unrealistic sense, able to diffuse the violence because he approached with the spirit of goodness and godliness within, right? What are you doing? We don't know he doesn't go on to tell what the story looked like and the exchange. We're missing the exchange between him and the other people. But he certainly doesn't win over the situation by being the kind of person who has his hand on the back of his enemy's neck. Instead, he wins over the situation because of the way that the totafot, the way the tefillin, the way that these amulets it's not the amulets themselves or the name of God that's causing fear, but rather the way that he is and the way that he shows up in that space and in all spaces. So I leave you with these teachings about the challenging teaching about the notion that fear can in fact be induced by being such a loving and God-fearing presence that we actually cause other people to not want to end their harmful behavior because we are present in that space, because of the goodness that we represent in that space, and because of the way that the words of those paragraphs of the Shema enter us and how we show up in the world. And if you want to be a little less Pollyannish about it and say, well, someone's goodness is not certainly going to stop the violence that's taking place in the world, at least this is a text that argues that a constant sense, a physical constant sense of closeness with the divine is in fact the kind of protective thing that would keep us even from physical harm. That the notion of being in relationship with God will somehow, in perhaps a metaphysical sense that we don't understand, but the Vilna Gaon purported to understand, that kind of closeness and relationship to God allows for one to induce a sense of fear out of goodness and not a fear out of brute strength.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.